Between the snow-capped peaks of the Andes, hundreds of young girls vanished, one by one, leaving behind only whispers and grief that still echoes through the valleys today. Their families searched the rivers, the forests, the roads, but the monster they feared was already among them. A man who smiled like a friend, spoke softly, and carried death wherever he went. He was called El Monstruo de los Andes, the monster of the Andes, a name that would haunt 3 countries and expose one of the most horrifying killing sprees the world has ever known. Tonight we uncover how Pedro Alonso López lured innocence into darkness, escaped justice, and vanished, leaving behind the question that still chills investigators to this day. Is the monster of the Andes still alive? Pedro Alonso López, the monster of the Andes. The Andes stretch like a spine across South America, raw, jagged, eternal. The Andes stretch like a spine across South America, raw, jagged, eternal. At dawn, the peaks are shrouded in fog, their valleys echoing with the distant hum of bells and market voices. In the heart of Ecuador, in the small city of Ambato, the scent of guava mingles with coal smoke. Vendors call out prices. Children dart between stalls. And the day begins as it always has, unaware that beneath the rhythm of life, something monstrous breathes. For years, young girls had been disappearing from these streets, vanishing into thin air. Some left home to fetch water and never returned. Others were last seen walking to school, ribbons still tied neatly in their hair. Their names faded into whispers, their faces replaced by new absences. Police called them runaways. Families buried empty coffins. But by 1980, the truth would surface, quite literally, when the rains came. And when the earth opened its mouth, the Andes would reveal what they had been hiding. The work of a man who called himself the instrument of God. Pedro Alonso López entered this world on October 8, 1948, in the rural department of Tolima, Colombia. His birth was not marked by joy but by the thunder of civil war. This was the time of La Violencia, a bloody conflict between conservatives and liberals that left more than 200,000 dead. Colombia's rivers were filled with the bodies of farmers, rebels, and innocents alike. Pedro's father was one of them, a guerrilla fighter, executed before his son's birth. His mother, Benilda López, worked the streets of Tolima as a prostitute, trying to feed her many children. There was no tenderness in their home, only survival. Pedro grew up in a one-room shack filled with the smell of alcohol and strangers. The men came and went. Violence was constant. His mother's temper was short, her beatings unpredictable. He learned early that silence was safer than speech, that the world belonged to those who struck first. At the age of 9, Pedro committed an act that would sever him from what little family he had. One night, in a moment of confusion and desperation for affection, he reached out to touch his mother while she was with a client. The man roared. His mother's rage exploded. She beat him savagely, her hands fueled by humiliation and fury, and then dragged him to the street. "You are no son of mine," she spat, and then she locked the door. Pedro waited outside until dawn, shivering, hoping she might change her mind. She never did. That was the day Pedro Alonso López became a child of the streets, one of the thousands who wandered Bogota's alleys in the 1950s, surviving on theft, cunning, and sheer will. Bogota's underbelly was a graveyard for forgotten children. They slept under market stalls, in doorways, in cardboard boxes that barely shielded them from the cold. They scavenged food from garbage, formed packs for safety, and disappeared just as easily as they had arrived. Pedro became one of them, small, hungry, invisible. He learned how to steal without being seen, how to spot danger before it reached him. But for a child alone, danger was everywhere. A man approached him one day, smiling, offering shelter, a bed, food, safety. Pedro followed him, and that night, the man raped him. The pain and confusion curdled into something else. A quiet, burning hatred. In that darkness, the child who once begged for love began to rot. Years later, when police asked him why he killed, Lopez said quietly, "That was when I decided that if I was ever strong enough, I would do to others what they did to me." Through his teenage years, Lopez drifted through Colombia, living off theft and petty crimes. He was arrested several times for stealing, for assault, but never stayed in jail long. Each time he was released, he became a little colder, a little more detached from what the world called normal. At 18, he stole a car and was sent to prison. If he had known cruelty before, what awaited him there was something far worse. He was beaten and raped by fellow inmates. But this time, he did not cower. Later, he would claim that he killed 3 of his attackers, strangling one with a wire, stabbing another with a makeshift knife. Whether true or not, prison records did show that Lopez was involved in multiple violent incidents during his sentence. When he was finally released, something inside him had hardened beyond repair. He walked out of those gates not as a victim, but as something new. He once told a reporter, "Prison taught me what power feels like. Once I had it, I never wanted to let it go." After his release, Lopez vanished into the mountains. He drifted across Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, blending in with the poor and the invisible. He sold small trinkets in markets, worked as a laborer, and slept wherever he could find shelter. He waited. He learned that in small towns, people trusted easily. Children roamed freely. A soft-spoken man with kind eyes could move through a village unnoticed. It was during these years, the early 1970s, that he began to hunt. The girls were always young, between 8 and 12. He would offer them candy or small toys, lead them to the countryside, and when they were far from help, he would strangle them. He buried their bodies in shallow graves, sometimes returning to sit beside them. In his later confessions, he claimed that watching the sunrise on his victims gave him peace. "It was beautiful," he said. "When the light touched their faces, I felt calm." By 1978, Lopez had crossed into Peru, targeting the indigenous villages of the Ayacucho region. There, the people noticed the disappearances. They were poor, yes, but not blind. One morning, as Lopez tried to lure a young girl away, villagers caught him in the act. They bound him, stripped him naked, and beat him. The crowd swelled. There would be no trial, no delay. They would bury him alive. They dug a pit, threw him inside, and began to cover him with earth. But fate, or chance, intervened. A missionary who lived nearby rushed forward, begging for his life. She pleaded with the villagers to hand him over to the police instead. The crowd relented. The police took Lopez into custody, but the Peruvian system was overwhelmed and indifferent. Instead of jailing him, they deported him across the border to Ecuador. And once again, Pedro Alonso López was free. From 1978 to 1980, the Andean countryside fell under a silent plague. In towns like Ambato, Quito, and Cuenca, little girls disappeared almost weekly. The victims were mostly from poor indigenous families. They vanished after market days, on their way home from errands, from fields or riversides. Police chalked the cases up to poverty, migration, even trafficking. Few believed there was a single predator. But in the highlands, whispers began. Stories of a tall man with a soft voice and a patient smile. Children started to fear the kind stranger. Still, the killings continued. Then came the flood. In 1980, torrential rain struck Ambato. Landslides tore through the hillsides, carrying away earth and secrets. When the storms cleared, villagers searching through the debris found small bones, then full skeletons, little dresses still clinging to them. 4 bodies. Then 5. Then dozens. The police came with shovels and cameras. What they unearthed horrified even the most hardened detectives. The newspapers called it Los Campos de la Muerte, the death fields of the Andes. And still, no one knew who the killer was. It happened in the Ambato market, the same place where laughter and bartering filled the air. A woman named Maria Poveda, a street vendor, saw a man talking to her daughter. He was offering trinkets, coaxing her to follow. Something in his eyes, calm, cold, made her scream. Bystanders chased him down and pinned him to the ground. When police arrived, they found his bag. Inside were children's clothes, jewelry, and ribbons, trophies from the vanished girls. The man said his name was Pedro Alonso López. He smiled as they cuffed him. At first, he denied everything, but when the interrogation stretched into hours, his composure changed. A strange serenity overtook him. Then, he began to speak. Over days of questioning, Lopez told investigators stories that made them sick. He described how he lured, killed, and buried young girls across 3 countries. He spoke of the Peruvian hills, of Ecuador's valleys, of Colombian villages where children still played barefoot in the dust, unaware of what walked among them. He confessed to killing more than 300 girls. Police followed him to grave sites in the mountains. He pointed calmly, one by one, and each time they dug, they found small skeletons, the bones of girls who had simply vanished. Interpol confirmed over 110 bodies in Ecuador alone. The rest were believed to be scattered across Peru and Colombia. When asked if he regretted anything, he smiled. "No," he said. "I felt the light of God when I killed. I am his messenger." Psychiatrists later described him as a classic sociopath, intelligent, manipulative, utterly devoid of empathy. But to the families, he was something else entirely. He was the devil who wore a human face. In 1980, Pedro Alonso López was convicted of 110 murders, the most any man in Ecuador had ever been charged with. But Ecuador's laws had limits. At that time, the maximum sentence for any crime, even mass murder, was just 16 years. 16 years for hundreds of stolen lives. When the verdict was read, Lopez stood motionless. Then he smiled. He was 32 years old. He would walk free by his mid-40s. In prison, Lopez behaved impeccably. He read the Bible, attended chapel, and charmed guards with his quiet manner. Those who met him described a man who seemed strangely serene, polite, even gentle. But behind his eyes, something cold watched. When reporters visited, he talked freely. He said he dreamed of the girls often. "They are not dead," he told one journalist. "They live with me in spirit. They are happy." For 14 years, the monster of the Andes sat in his cell, waiting. And when his sentence ended, the world would learn that evil is not easily contained. The iron gates of the Ambato prison opened with a slow groan. The guards didn't look him in the eye as he walked out. It was 1994, 14 years after his conviction. The sun fell over the Andes in pale gold, and Pedro Alonso López, the confessed killer of hundreds of girls, stepped into the light once more. He smiled faintly, breathing in the thin air of freedom. It was the same air that his victims had once breathed, the same valleys that had hidden their bones. He said nothing. He simply began to walk. Lopez had served 14 of his 16 years, released early for good behavior. To prison officials, he was the model inmate. He attended chapel services, obeyed every order, and showed no aggression. His calmness was mistaken for rehabilitation, but psychiatrists warned otherwise. A medical report labeled him a dangerous psychopath incapable of remorse. The warning was ignored. Ecuadorian law at the time made no provision for indefinite imprisonment or post-release supervision. Once his term was complete, there was nothing to keep him behind bars. So, with no parole, no oversight, and no apology, Lopez was free. The mothers of Ambato wept in disbelief. "He'll kill again," one shouted at the prison gates. But her voice was drowned out by the crowd, by the noise of life moving on, and by the man walking quietly into the fog. The Ecuadorian government, unwilling to keep him, immediately deported Lopez to Colombia. He was handed over to authorities there, who charged him with a single unresolved murder, that of a 12-year-old girl from 1969. For a moment, it seemed justice might still find him, but bureaucracy triumphed over morality. The case was old, evidence scarce, and prosecutors unmotivated. Within months, The charges were dropped. Lopez walked out of the Colombian courthouse a free man once more, carrying nothing but a paper bag and the faintest smile. A journalist who saw him that day described him as ordinary, almost forgettable. The kind of man you could pass in the street without a second glance. That was precisely what made him so dangerous. After his release in 1998, Lopez disappeared completely. Police lost track of him within weeks. Rumors spread through the Andean corridor. Some said he was seen in Bogotá, begging on the streets. Others whispered that he'd crossed into Venezuela, living under a new name. One theory placed him working with a traveling carnival. Another said he joined a Christian sect, pretending to be a reformed soul preaching salvation to the poor. None of it could be verified. Interpol issued an alert, keeping his name on the wanted list for years. But there were no arrests, no confirmed sightings. The monster of the Andes had simply dissolved into the mountains that had once hidden his crimes. To understand how a man like Lopez could vanish, you must understand the landscape he moved through. The Andes are vast, wild, and fractured, a chain of villages scattered across valleys where the law barely reaches. In these remote places, record-keeping is rare, and poverty is deep. A stranger can arrive, live, and leave without anyone ever asking his name. For Lopez, this was perfect. In interviews before his disappearance, he had spoken chillingly of what he might do after freedom. "They will never catch me again," he said. "I will be like the wind, invisible." He hinted that there were still little girls waiting for me. Psychiatrists warned that his fantasies were still active, that he remained obsessed with children, purity, and control. But there was no mechanism to stop him. And so, the world's most prolific serial killer simply walked away. In the early 2000s, Ecuadorian and Colombian journalists tried to trace him. They found fragments, reports of missing children in rural Colombia that echoed his pattern. Poor families, young girls, no ransom, no body. But the evidence was always inconclusive. Police in Bogotá briefly detained a homeless man in 2002 who matched Lopez's description. Gaunt face, graying hair, quiet demeanor. But fingerprint comparisons were inconclusive, and the man disappeared upon release. In 2005, a rumor emerged that Lopez had been rearrested in Colombia for another child's murder. The story was widely reported and quickly debunked. It had been a case of mistaken identity. Still, the fact that journalists and police wanted to believe it speaks volumes. They could not accept that a man who killed 300 children was simply gone. Lopez's story is not just the tale of a killer. It is also the story of a justice system that never saw its victims. His prey were poor, brown, indigenous girls, children from families who lived on the margins of society. When they vanished, police shrugged. When mothers begged for help, they were told their daughters had probably run away. The scale of his crimes could only exist in a world where those lives were considered disposable. By the time authorities realized a serial killer was operating across the Andes, the death toll had already crossed into hundreds. Even then, Lopez's trial received little international attention. There were no television cameras, no global outrage. The victims' names were never fully recorded. Most graves remained unmarked. In the end, he became a statistic, a dark legend whispered among those who remembered. Psychiatrists who studied Lopez called him a perfect sociopath. He lacked empathy, conscience, or fear, but he was intelligent, methodical, calculating, and deeply manipulative. In interviews during his imprisonment, he often seemed calm and polite, even charming. He would smile while describing his murders as if recounting a day's work. He once told a reporter from Lahore, "I am the man of God. He sent me to do it." He spoke of his killings as if they were a divine act, a cleansing, a ritual of purity. Psychologists believe this delusion of divine purpose helped him rationalize his atrocities. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as a chosen instrument, punishing the world that had once humiliated him. That delusion made him untouchable, even to his own guilt. To this day, Interpol and Ecuadorian police verify 110 confirmed murders linked directly to Lopez through confessions and evidence. But his own statements placed the number far higher, up to 350 victims across Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. Even if half of his claims were exaggerations, the scale remains staggering, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. Criminologists who reviewed the case describe Lopez as an opportunistic predator rather than a sadist. His crimes lacked ritual beyond the act of strangulation and burial. He killed swiftly and repeatedly, almost mechanically. His motivation, experts argue, was rooted in control, a psychological reversal of his own victimization. He once said, "When I killed the first time, I felt something break inside me. After that, it was easy. I felt no fear, only peace." In the annals of true crime, Pedro Alonso López is both infamous and strangely forgotten. Unlike Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, his story unfolded far from the cameras, in villages without telephones, among families without power to demand justice. There were no televised trials, no psychological profiles splashed across headlines, only rumors, police sketches, and whispered warnings. In many ways, his anonymity protected him, both before and after his capture. The world was not ready to believe that a single man could kill hundreds of children and walk free. But Lopez's story also forces an uncomfortable question. How many others like him may have existed, operating unseen in places where poverty silences screams? Decades have passed since Lopez disappeared. The families of his victims still live in the same villages, the same valleys where their daughters vanished. They still light candles at unmarked graves. Some of them remember him not by name, but by the whisper, "El hombre de las dulces," the man with the sweets. For them, justice never came. For the world, Lopez became a legend, a name half remembered, his photo buried deep in police archives. Even now, when journalists ask officials in Ecuador about him, many sigh and shake their heads. "He's a ghost," one investigator said. "Sometimes I think he's still out there." If Pedro Alonso López is alive today, he would be well into his 70s, an old man with a thin gray beard, perhaps living in obscurity under another name. He could be selling fruit on a roadside, preaching in a village chapel, or simply watching the world forget. Or he could be dead, buried in an unmarked grave, just as he buried his victims. No one knows. But his shadow lingers in the mountains, not as myth, but as memory. A warning that evil does not always wear a monster's face. The Lopez case reshaped criminal law in Ecuador. His conviction, and the outrage that followed, led to reforms increasing prison sentences for homicide and allowing life imprisonment for aggravated murder. But for many, the change came too late. Lopez had already shown what happens when justice looks away. He is studied today by criminologists as a textbook case of psychopathy, childhood abuse, early violence, sexual trauma, escalating aggression, and the total absence of remorse. But to the people of the Andes, he is not a subject of study. He is a curse that once walked among them. In his last known interview, conducted inside prison before his release, Lopez sat calmly before the reporter. He was asked what he felt when he thought about the girls. He smiled faintly. "They will always be mine," he said. "No one can take them from me." The reporter wrote later that the room felt colder after those words. Perhaps that was the true horror of Pedro Alonso López. Not only what he did, but how easily he believed it was justified. 100 valleys, 1,000 graves, and somewhere, perhaps, the ghost of a man who vanished into the fog he was born from. He was called El Monstruo de los Andes, the monster of the Andes. And though the mountains have long since fallen silent, his story remains a scar carved into their stones. The case of Pedro Alonso López stands as one of the darkest chapters in the history of South American crime. It exposes how systemic poverty, corruption, and neglect can allow horror to thrive unseen. Lopez's victims were not nameless. Each had a family, a life, and dreams abruptly erased. Their silence is the true legacy of this story. Because when justice fails to speak for the voiceless, monsters like Lopez do not need to hide, the world hides them. Evil, one investigator said, is not only what a man does, it's what the world allows to happen. And in the high shadows of the Andes, that evil still echoes. If this story disturbed and gripped you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Crime Spectrum, where every story is real, every victim is remembered, and every shadow has a name.